times. I would say the second half of the 20th century, with a powerful opposition, if you want, of Venice and Marghera, it was one of the most powerful statements of the evolution and decline of the industrial era in the Western societies, while in our time is obviously one of the places in which climate change is much more powerful in its effects. And actually, these pictures are the ones of the day Eugenio Cecconi described before. It's October 3rd, 2020, the first day the MOSE operated. And I have to say that what I'm going to show to you, it's a work developed between 2017-18 up to our time. And I think we should all remember that when we develop our work and our research, it's not neutral, if I may do that. And especially those first years between 2018, 2021, 22 have been in particular years of Venice. First of all, because as you've seen before, obviously, we experienced the repeated tides of November 2019, and then the globe was hit by the pandemic in February 2020. And so that was a time in Venice when I was a bit skeptical, honestly, but many people said it's going to be a radical change, we can rethink our model of economy, tourism should be shaped in a different manner, there's going to be new space for apartments for students from universities, and all of that remained, I think, just in discussions at the time. But also, for instance, you had another tangible effect. Basically, the real estate value of all the ground floor in Venice before the MOSE was operated was half than before, because basically it was not deemed habitable anymore. And so, as I was saying, it was a very intense period in which to reflect about the future of this territory. So this is the infrastructure, as Eugenio Cecconi made very clear before, that somehow regulates the way in which the city of the Lagoon works today. If you have the chance, I think you were there, Eugenio Cecconi, that day too, on this visit. If you have the chance to visit the MOSE, this is the tunnel that runs below the yellow gates, from which then you have a room for each of one gate. And above this, you have a control room where in each lagoon mouth the gates are operated, and they can be operated all together up or in different ways, so that you might imagine to control the flux of the waters. What I think is very important, I think also I refer again to his presentation before, is to the goal of the book with Lorenzo, the other team, Mila's here, and many other people who contributed. For us was very important. It's not that the scenario I'm going to show to you later on, that you might have seen before, for us is the most correct, or is the most important, but what we want to bring back to attention in the public discussion is what to do with the lagoon in the coming decades. Because either you agree with the MOSE or not, you can consider it somehow closed. What's relevant nowadays is that the MOSE is there, and it's there to allow us time to reflect on what to do on time. Because if we wake up too late, it's going to be a great problem. And one of the problems we think of the MOSE is that from the city, when the MOSE is activated, it's basically invisible. And that's, I think, it's a dangerous condition, so that I think many people living here thinks that with the MOSE the problem is solved, while actually solved just from decades if this infrastructure will operate. So if this is the present, just a few steps back. The first is the fact that we do think that somehow history repeats. And this is a map from a book by Vladimiro Dorigo in the 1980s, which somehow reports archaeological studies that were done in the last century, and there's now even more proof of this. Basically referring to the fact that in Roman times, more or less 2,000 years ago, the sea level was much lower, 1.5 meters. Large part of the lagoon, basically countryside, centrally so that once more we understand how the lagoon, also in geological terms, is not a stable entity, but is something that is very dynamic and has a short life in geological terms. So this is also to state how over the centuries, somehow in the high medieval times, the waters rose, and somehow all the first islands, from Malamocco to Rialto, Rialto to Cello, they slowly formed from like the people defending themselves from the rising waters. So facing the rising waters is not a new challenge in Eastern Italy. What's new, and what was very also clear from his slides, is the pace to which this phenomena happens. And this is the second map of the rig again, in which you can find traces of this situation still in the city layers. The second element, which is very important, that I think you all understood clearly, is how there could have been no Venice without a lagoon, because the lagoon provided was a key element in military terms. Venice was a city without walls, defended just by the shallow waters around it. Was a key element in health terms. Still today there's no sewage system, so once you flush your toilet it goes in the canal directly, and it's the tide which is cleaning the canals. And then obviously food production and so on. So if today one of the challenges we are facing in the lagoon is marinization, so the fact that there's the erosion of the lagoon basin and essentially the central part of the lagoon after the Petroli Canal especially was built in the 60s has been eroded. Around 800 years ago, the challenge was the opposite. Rivers as the Brenta and the Sila were feeding the lagoon, so that there was also the threat that armies by walk could reach the sea. And so, as you might know, maybe in that period, during one of the crusades, Venice was somehow found itself leading the crusade, and this group of countries conquered Constantinople. Constantinople was looted, and in Venice you can still find traces, especially in St. Mark's Basilica, where all the stones of the Masad, many of them come from there, the four horses, and all of this. But what was also relevant is that in those years, there was a discussion in the Council of Ten about if to move the whole city from Venice to Constantinople, because basically the living conditions in Venice were under threat. And from one vote, they decided to stay in Venice. So you should also understand what was at stake at the time. And from that year on, a lot of energy in terms of money, intellectual money, politics, discussion throughout the whole level of society were carried out in order to preserve the lagoon in a kind of status quo that could allow the city to survive. And there's another relevant, I think, historical fact that is related to the fact that in 1487, the Portuguese discovered a new route around the African continent to reach the Indies, and the Venetians immediately understood how their monopoly of the commerce of spices and goods from Asia to Europe was under threat, so that the result of this is that other countries, Portugal, Spain, and then Netherlands, UK, took control of global commerce, and the Venetians basically turned their activity from the sea to the mainland, and the whole restructuring of the northeastern territory, Palladio, and Hellas, and all that story. But what's very interesting is that in the beginning of the 6th century, there was again a discussion, actually not again, there was a discussion about proposing to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to cut the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal, as you might know, was actually cut in the mid-19th century with the tools that were available at the time. So you could imagine what had been meant to develop such an enterprise at the time. But I think it's also very revealing of the degree of self-awareness the Venetians developed over the centuries about the possibility to bend and modify the territory to their needs. This is a paper you find in the State Archive in Venice that reports a discussion about the Suez Canal and then the cross means that they finally decided not to proceed for also other reasons that are of different nature. So what actually happened is that over the centuries Venice was able to defeat other cities in the northeast, Padua, Vicenza, Verona and so on, and finally to control the whole territory of the northeast, more or less from Falcone to Brescia. So that also they controlled the flux of the rivers from the Alps to the sea. This was also strategic for the wood production, obviously to produce ships, but also then to redirect rivers and to control agriculture. In 1505 it was founded a very important institution that was actually the Magistrate of the Waters that was unluckily suppressed for a corruption scandal for the Mose. And one of the most important figures of this institution was Cristoforo Saladino. He's one of the main figures of the book Venice in the Renaissance by Tafuri. And Saladino was the proto, the head of the Magistrate of the Waters. And as before, over the centuries, understood that the main threat at the time was the filling in of the lagoon through the sediments. He proposed to deviate a set of rivers, in particular the Brenta and the Sile, that were the ones that were mainly filling the lagoon. So this enterprise was carried out over a couple of centuries. It was not a smooth enterprise. There was trial and errors, a lot of complicated procedures. I think it's also very interesting what Engineer Ciccone referred before about this structure that Saladino he more or less reinforced the wooden structure with a stone one from San Erasmo. So this kind of very empiric knowledge and way of modifying the lagoon, I think is a lesson that we should keep precious from the ancient times. So somehow in the mid-18th century, the Venetians were able to reach a kind of status quo in which the main rivers were deviated, the murazzi along the Palestrina river were built, and they also produced a jurisdictional and administrative entity titled Contaminazione Lagunare. That was the area in which the Magistrate of the Waters had complete control. And so this is a map that they produced that somehow sums up a series of major modifications that Laguna suffered over the centuries. And this is a map showing in red the perimeter of the lagoon in 1810. So this is around 15 years after the lagoon, the Venice Republic fell by hand of Napoleon. It was a survey run by me. And what you see in black are the contours of the lagoon today. Just the bridge is missing there. And the dots you see are the markers in siti di contaminazione lagunare, so that are markers that were put in order to clarify what was the edge of this contaminazione lagunare. The ones in black are the ones still in place. As you can see, there's many of them also San Erasmo, because basically the lagoon mouth of Lido was formed just when the French built the jetties in the early 19th century. And first research I done, also in collaboration with Professor Fabiani, was a research which, with narrative, also tool of retracing this line, connecting these dots, was to also have the possibility to engage with topics that are very timely for Venice and its lagoon, and also to encounter spaces that you would never otherwise easily face. Now the key moment was when the Austrians built a railway bridge in the 19th century, that basically reversed the way we enter the city. So in the past you entered from the sea and St. Mark's Basin. Nowadays 95.5 of us, I think, we entered from the And this is just a few years after, during one of the revolts of the Venetians against the Austrians, the railway bridge was known, and for a few months Venice was an island again. But as we all know then, Miozzi built the automobile bridge in the 1930s, and I think Miozzi has a lot to teach, because he was on one side a very skillful civil engineer, but I think what we should learn in general is how every infrastructure he envisioned, he planned, had a very clear role both at the local, regional and European scale. Maybe we're happy that some of them were not realized, because then we would face a kind of different Venice with a lot of more cars around. So on one side we might be happy it didn't happen. But for instance, this is a road that Miozzi was planning to build from the Polesine. It was an area recently reclaimed in the 1920s and 30s by the fascist regime, connecting this area to Venice, with the idea to give back to Venice a central role in the Veneto region when Padua was somehow gaining more relevance. So one of the first options would have been having this road along Chioggia, Mestrina, Lido, and then from Lido to Giudecca and around. This is a view he developed in the 30s. And then the third option is floating pontoons. The second option after the war, when there was a road from Tessera, where we have the airport nowadays, connecting into Sant'Erasmo and Cavallino. But always with the clear idea that to him it was important somehow, in a period when the demographic shift was from the Laguna city center towards the mainland, his idea was to basically build a kind of donut around the city center so that the center would be back at the heart of the system. And basically the idea was to develop fully in residential terms the Vignole, Sant'Erasmo and Cavallino that you can see black, and even more again, Lido and Murano. And then he developed this always with a very deep territorial vision, but also kind of set of sometimes also brilliant technological solutions, as well as, for instance, proposing a new highway from the port of Venice to Bavaria, so somehow turning it into the port of southern Germany, a very rich, still today, region. And another key element we should always keep in mind is the socio-economical framework in which these projects are developed. So this was the demographic forecast in after the war, for which they imagined that the city center of Venice would have gained a few thousand of inhabitants, while the mainland would have skyrocketed. And actually we know what really actually happened is this curve, so that nowadays in Mestre and the mainland you have more than 200,000 people living, while Venice, we all know that lost 2/3 of inhabitants in this element. So closer to our times, this is a map that was developed by Lorenzo Fabian, Paolo Vigano, and the whole team that developed the research that led to the publication Extreme City. And you can see black all of the areas that are going to be subject more dramatically to sea level rise in Europe, and obviously northeastern Italy is among them. This is obviously not just a European phenomenon, it's a global one, but I think it's important to underline how many of the numbers we get from IPCC or other institutions are an average which is global, while in some oceanic context the sea level rise might be even up to 2-3 meters, and in Mediterranean lower, and even in Mediterranean the impacts are different. So it is somehow a global challenge, but on the other side it's also a local one. So we should always keep in mind these two dimensions. This is another map from a different institution from the center that underlines the areas which are more at risk from sea level rise. And I think it's interesting to pair this map with this map from the mid-15th century, in which you can see how basically the whole Adriatic coast from Ravenna, south of the Roma to Monfalcone, in an interrupted series of lagoons. Just two of them in our time existing, the one in Venice and Malagrado. But I think that somehow we even might go back to that kind of condition. Not the same exactly, obviously, but a condition that approximates that. So as I was saying before, after the first research on the markers, you can see some images here. It was an opportunity to discover many angles of the lagoon, the way they interact with different topics, from mobility to different forms of food production and fishing. The Mose, this is at the time the image was shot when the Mose works were not over yet. So this is the Cipo in the Laguna of Monaco. And also was, on that side, the fieldwork was a key also part of the research, so that looking for markers was also an opportunity to discover the same site we would normally visit in these terms. And a series of also workshops with students of different origins was developed. And a series of studies in which in 2021, 71 and 2120, what you see is the waters, how they would rise without the Mose, and if the system of embankment would somehow collapse, which is something that it's not maybe super probable, but as we've seen also in the last years in Ravenna, sometimes these systems, they have breaks because of animals carving holes and so on. And so this was operated both in zenithal view, but also through more immersive views that still have the same temporal scanning, if you want. And in different spots of the lagoon, this is Palestina, for instance, Monaco again, Lido, and Sant'Erasmo, Cavallino, to finish with Fusina, where there is the camping with the entrance designed by Carlo Scala. And so after this also became part of the work that Lorenzo was developing with his team, and also with a series of different classes over the years of students. And finally the book, we decided to publish it in English first because, as I said before, we strongly believe that the one of Venice is a case study of global relevance. And it seemed relevant to us to take for granted that everyone should know how the lagoon works in specific terms. So there is a whole set of diagrams and definitions that somehow explain the way the lagoon operates. This idea of transition gradients, also engineering economy was referring before to the different degrees of heights below water level, in between and above, and different species that you can find. It's somehow obviously more compressed, but also relates to the way mountains operate. You find different conditions in their terms. And also I think you can connect the lagoon and the mountains in the way that the lagoon is not super, it takes time to cross the lagoon. It's not in spatial terms pretty close, but then it takes kind of time to reach, especially several destinations. The lagoon then always often has been a kind of riddle for many also hydraulic engineers. There's a kind of legend that Leonardo da Vinci left the lagoon having not a very clear idea of how the lagoon worked. And somehow, as I was saying, theory was always the past paired with empiric knowledge. And I think it's very interesting also that in historical documents you find how meetings were called by the government pairing old fishermen with scientists, so that the kind of different knowledge was crossed. There's a reflection on a tool of the scenario as a planning tool. I take it a bit for granted, but I think you all know as students of architecture and urbanism how scenario is a very powerful tool to reflect on the future, but also on the present of our spaces. And then we produced maps, that images that somehow reconstruct three scenarios. The first is a business as usual scenario in which we imagine that not much or nothing is done to tackle the effects of climate change. From effects on the coasts, erosion to salt intrusion, to effects on the inner part of the lagoon, to a whole set of other problems. The second one reconstructs the scenarios that engineer Luigi Dal Paus developed over the decades for the lagoon. And somehow his idea, to put it very simply, is to try to rebuild the kind of balance that was somehow lost, especially with the construction of the Petroni Canal and the stronger currents that eroded the lagoon over time. And this is a scenario in which it seems that more importance is given to the lagoon as a total artifact, where the idea is to reconstruct the barrier to complete the hydroway Padova-Venezia, so that sediments could be brought back from the drain to the lagoon. But there's a big question mark about Venice, because in this idea, the lagoon will still be, the mouth will be open. So basically, I would say Venice, it will be flooded. The first scenario is the one of complete, or the whole lagoon turned into lake. It's one that especially physicist Georg Gisser presented. Gisser was until a few years ago the head of the National Center for Research in Venice. And he was saying something very logical, if you want, that also Engineer Ciccone explained before, that if the sea will rise as forecasted, the Mosa will be gates very often up, turning, as a matter of fact, the lagoon into lake. And that would cause a lot of problems because, as I was saying before, there is no sewage system in Venice, so you have health issues, there's boats to work with oil, there's a whole series of questions that should be answered. So for us, I think these two scenarios, the one by Gisser and the one by Dal Paus, I think somehow in between the lines they say either you save the lagoon or you save Venice somehow. And I think it's clear that we cannot keep everything as it was. We cannot save both in the same way. And we should make a judgment of what's more relevant to us. So if you ask me, obviously I'm not a Bible, but this is my opinion. I think Venice is unique globally, and we still have many lagoons in the globe. So I think we're allowed to modify the lagoon to preserve Venice. We can discuss about this for how much you want. But starting from this point of view, our proposal is also kind of reflecting on the scenario that Engineer was showing before, is to subdivide the lagoon in different parts, in which basically you would have a central part which is in which you control the level of the waters with a series of locks in which you can control the height. And we would preserve the southern and northern lagoons and even expanded them in some of the territories that were reclaimed in the 1920s that nowadays are not so productive anymore. And also require a lot of energy to be kept dry, and this is somehow not working very well, also with the goal that the European Union set for 2015 of carbon neutral condition. So this idea of dividing the lagoon is not something that we invent overnight. And over the centuries, many different scientists or thinkers they reflected about this. From Cornaro, who was somehow, if you want, the enemy of Christian fully of Sabadino. Sabadino himself, when he was reflecting about how to make the rain deliver, the whole series of engineers that was innovation in the 17th century that was proposing to build a lake from Chioggia and a very long embankment behind the lagoon to Miozzi again, that in his late studies in the 1960s was reflecting about the way to protect and preserve. So somehow this is a kind of picture of how we might imagine the city and its context, the lagoon in 100 years from now, if you want. And I want to underline this is also a kind of the result of a series of different operations in which you could imagine to start with a series of, for instance, reinforcing of the barene, the sand banks, in a way that is somehow close to one that Paul's proposed, with the idea then to, if the sea will rise at the sea, to build up, in this case, differently from his proposal, the embankments will be along the Petroli Canal and along a more curvy edge on this side, so that also tram would operate, so creating a kind of more metropolitan system of connection around the lagoon. The other element that we tried to express was that reflecting on this kind of future is not simply reflecting on the morphology of the lagoon, but also on which kind of society and economy would be there. And so for us it was also a way of reflecting on the nature of Venice that could go beyond tourism, especially in the city center, through the integration with culture and high studies, the way of reorganizing industrial areas of Porto Marghera through the ecological transition and new forms of production of energy, and also reflecting on ancient but at the same time very timely way of running the spaces of the lagoon. Thank you.